I have a message for New York. Central Park is mine. Hello, my name is Will and welcome to Exploding Helicopter, the only podcast in the world that studies helicopter explosions while wearing massive aviator sunglasses. Now, after Sylvester Stallone's First Blood became a box office success, American cinemas were suddenly full with films about troubled Vietnam veterans with axes to grind. But while Rambo's psychodrama played out in the wilds of Northwest America, the film we're reviewing on this show brought the action into an urban environment and the heart of New York City. So on this show, we're looking at The Park is Mine. And talking of troubled individuals who've seen too much straight-to-video fodder at any rate, my guest today is Rich Nelson from the Betamax Video Club. Welcome to the show, Rich.
Hi, Will. Thank you for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. Now, you're, as I mentioned, you are the host of the Betamax Film Club, and as the name suggests, there is an 80s focus on the films that you review on your podcast. So I kind of wondered, why you decided to pick that decade.
I think looking back, it was the decade I was born, albeit sort of 9 weeks into the decade, and remembering all the films that I grew up watching far too young. It was the decade when we had a guy driving around in a van who would allow us to rent videos from the back, which I think these days would be somewhat frowned upon. Just remembering the sort of times and the stories that tell about how when I was, I think, 8 and my dad took me and my slightly younger brother to the video shop and just said, look, get what you want. We came back with Predator. And as my mum walked into the part where they found Hopper's body hanging from the tree, and there's me and an 8-year-old and a 7-year-old sitting there going, wow, that stuck with me. And I still have several videos around the house now, even though I don't have anything to play them on. And they always seem to be the films that stick out for me. The action films are, I suppose, the meat and veg, the ones that I really enjoy digging back into. And anything from Commando to Predator and I suppose anything with Schwarzenegger at the time, really. But it was a rich decade for style, perhaps over substance in some cases.
So it sounds as if it's largely the fact that that particular decade holds a nostalgic feel for you. But do you, or would you also argue that it's a great decade for film, or the best decade for film?
No, I don't think I could argue that. And even the films that were doing well in the Academy Awards in the decade were ones that, I'll be honest, aren't ones that I really would consider favourites. You look at films like Amadeus or Out of Africa, The Last Emperor. They're not films that I look back at with any fondness in a lot of cases because I didn't see them at the time. And if I'm looking at an era of films that were more my sort of thing for quality, I'd have to say the 70s, where you had films like The Conversation or The Godfather or The French Connection, or even my favourite film was probably Superman, all in 70s, and perhaps I could have picked that one, but the 80s is the one for the nostalgia, really, because of everything else that goes up of actually being a child in the decade, with the music and the fashion, and the fact that even these days the 80s seems to be remembered quite fondly, and the sequel to Wonder Woman is set in 1984, so that promises gold anyway.
Now, as you know, this is the world's only podcast dedicated to celebrating films where helicopters explode. And while I've chosen to dedicate my life to that pursuit, I appreciate that not everyone is necessarily interested in the same goal. So, as you're a guest here today, I wondered, are you fascinated by this strange phenomenon, or, are you just a disinterested observer?
I'm very much a fan. I think it's one of
what we like to hear.
Yeah, I'd love to say it's like a calling card. It's in a lot of cases it is. It's almost like, you'd hate to say a cliche, but if you see an exploding helicopter or any sort of vehicle really with the potential to store explosive liquid within, the explosion is going to be good in most cases. And even now, I know in some of your previous episodes where in Bond films, for example, they're still doing it up till now. I think the Skyfall episode, because there's nothing. To a lot of people, even a helicopter on its own is exotic, and it's not exactly a common way of travel. So seeing a helicopter, and then what do we do to make it more exciting? Let's make it explode. There's a science behind it.
There certainly is, and it is a science that we are aiming to explore in all its glorious detail. Right, I think it's time that we got stuck into The Park Is Mine. Now, I would tell you the name of the main character, but I can't remember his name. Somebody, please, tell me his name.
His name is Mitch Garnett.
I want you out of the park.
What are you hassling me for? Don't treat me like I'm some kind of junkie. I'm a vet.
I want you out of the park, now.
He's fighting back for everyone who was ever pushed too far.
Well, let's not have any stupid mistakes, okay? I don't want anybody to get hurt, and nobody will get hurt if we do everything my way.
He's unpredictable.
We are certain that a band of well-coordinated, well-trained guerrillas is responsible.
Unconventional.
I am the individual who controls the park.
It's one guy. One guy.
And completely unstoppable.
What are you doing in here?
You got something to say? Want to tell people something? You want the world to know about this? Let me get it on tape. I'll make sure it's seen.
I am staying in this park until 9 o'clock Wednesday night.
We will remove him before the deadline.
They wanted him out of the way.
I'm getting you out of here in first light.
Give me a break. We're both dead and you know it.
Now he's out of control. Tommy Lee Jones is a one-man revolution, and he's going to war against the city of New York.
The Park Is Mine is the story of Mitch, a troubled Vietnam veteran who's pretty unhappy with his lot in life. He's just lost his job, his marriage has broken up, and his wife won't let him see his kid. It's then that Mitch receives a message from beyond the grave. A mysterious letter arrives in the post. It's from an old war buddy who's just committed suicide because he has terminal cancer. In the letter, his dead friend explains that he's been stashing weapons and explosives in Central Park. He reveals that he's been planning to take over the park as a protest against the way that people like himself have been forgotten or ignored by society. His dying wish is for Mitch to complete his plan and make the country take notice of men like them. Now, most people would probably think that this was a terrible idea, but not our Mitch, who promptly takes control of the park in order to make his protest. Naturally, the police and city officials aren't too thrilled and make a variety of efforts to seize Central Park back. Now, this film came out in 1985, and it's actually a Canadian-produced TV movie. It stars Tommy Lee Jones as Mitch and the great Yaphet Kotto as a policeman drafted in to handle the crisis. It was directed by Stephen Hillard Stern, who had a long career directing TV movies, seemingly without too much distinction, although he did direct Rolling Vengeance, the Ned Beatty trucker revenge flick. The film has a 6.2 rating on IMDb and a similar audience rating on Rotten Tomatoes. But let's find out what my guest made of The Park Is Mine. Rich, what did you make of this?
I enjoyed the film. I believe it's easy to say that a film is good or bad, and I'm no film reviewer, I'm no film buff. I sat down and watched it for 101 minutes, and I did enjoy it. I think the story didn't take a lot to build up. It's hardly the most complicated, as you explained. Within sort of 15 minutes, Mitch is in the park and doing his reconnaissance, and even then he's getting picked on by the local police, and you know he's already had some hard times. He's struggling to hold the job, and he feels that veterans aren't getting perhaps not even the respect, just the common courtesy of being citizens. That the fact that they've come back from a war that was massively complex, trying to re-establish themselves in daily life, and his friend died. His friend had a very outlandish scheme, shall we say.
That's one way of describing it.
Yeah. It's I know there's ways and means of drawing people's attention to things. In this current decade, people start an online petition, or they bring social media out, or maybe get a jovial placard and stand outside a government building. But to take one of the world's great landmarks hostage was novel, because taking an inanimate object or a place hostage is something that you don't really see very often. It's normally people or a group of people or what they represent.
Do you think kids today just lack imagination?
I think so. It wouldn't surprise me to see people go and hold a McDonald's hostage if they run out of Happy Meal toys. But I think it goes to show as well that there was that element of loyalty where obviously Mitch isn't doing particularly well in life, and the fact that his friend has asked him to carry on this chore without, he can't even argue because the guy's dead, but he's obviously gone to a lot of hassle to store this firepower, and he takes to it quite well. He doesn't need much convincing, because what else is he going to do?
Well, he certainly doesn't. Yeah, he takes to it rather quickly. I do agree with the point you made about that this is a very economically told story, certainly at the beginning of it, because you were saying, oh, he's in the park in 15 minutes. I think it may even be quicker than that. I mean, it is, given that they're actually setting up quite a bit of stuff here with Tommy Lee Jones's buddy, with his family, and then also with Tommy Lee Jones's own state of mind. It establishes that all very, very quickly, and it's very economical storytelling. That said, this is this is a strange film. I found this a very odd watch indeed. Certainly held my attention, but I think mostly because of the odd politics of this particular movie, which I think we're going to get into in a bit more detail later. Though I do think it is sort of hampered by a number of very strange choices that take place in this movie, because I don't think that Tommy Lee Jones's agenda is terribly well explained, and the ending is a bit, it's a bit of a damp squib. But what I really wanted to kind of dig into was Tommy Lee Jones' agenda in this movie, because I wasn't exactly clear what he is protesting for, because there are several instances in the film where he talks about not being afforded enough respect. We see a scene in this film where he's hassled by a policeman, and he recounts a story of how somebody at work was mocking his background as somebody from a southern state or somebody from the Midwest, and a scene in this movie where Tommy Lee Jones is essentially articulating his agenda here. He's blackmailed the police into broadcasting his agenda on the news, and he reads off this collection of news clippings, and he's basically highlighting how people in New York are essentially selfish. And I didn't really quite get how the whole lack of respect thing tied into the selfishness aspect. I don't know, perhaps it made more sense to you, Rich.
I think it was strange and confused because the fact that they introduced Mitch as a fairly moderate character in the beginning. He didn't come across as any sort of extremist with any real political motives, other than perhaps things weren't going his way. But in the 80s, in most parts of the world, unless you were Michael Douglas in Wall Street, things were generally quite tough. And the fact is that coming back from Vietnam would be difficult. It would be an extra burden on your sort of physical, emotional state, the issues he has with his relationship. But by the time it got to reading out his manifesto on the radio, he sounded more like Frank Castle from The Punisher, where he's reading out my statement, my last will and testament. This is what's going to happen. This is why I'm doing it. And it doesn't seem that while they're trying to describe him and make him out to be a sympathetic character, to get him to turn into that almost angry at the world person, it takes a bit of a jump, which, to be honest, the rest of the film doesn't really afford you. And to have his motivations, which, while you can sympathise with them, you don't see that other than really the issue he has with the policeman and the fact that his wife is struggling because he can't provide. But this is the motivation for half the films of the 80s, I think. But it would have been nice to see some sort of exposition, or even just a flashback or something to show him in Vietnam, or him suffering really, that would cause this to happen, rather than the death of his friend and things aren't going his way, because, to be frank, it wasn't made particularly obvious.
Well, no, and I think that is one of the curious aspects of this film, is that the shadow of Vietnam sort of clearly hangs over this film, but we never really learn anything about Tommy Lee Jones's experience in Vietnam. It doesn't appear that he was physically wounded by his experience. There's no evidence of that. And there's no real evidence that even that he was psychologically wounded. It's very odd that they didn't actually put any meat on the bones.
Yeah, you can tell that Mitch has a very particular set of skills, to borrow from another film, that he's gone through things, he's done things in Vietnam that would bring a lot of pain to a lot of people and make someone really regret or certainly examine where they've been. But we only see the technical side of that, the fact that he seems quite proficient with bombs and explosives. And, you know, he's obviously, and his friend has obviously gone to the hassle of arranging blank firing ammunition so that it's for effect rather than for actually damaging or injuring anyone. But it just seems that he flips from moderate guy to very good with guns and explosives guy, but there's none of the motivation behind it. And there's so many films, even in that era, between First Blood and Full Metal Jacket and Platoon, even when, you know, while they're still there, that you see how much damage it causes to people. And yet all we see is Tommy Lee Jones is quite handy with a rocket launcher and an AK-47.
Yes, and I think that absence of some sort of Vietnam backstory then means that the film, or that the mechanics of the film, are left leaning a little bit too much on some of the things that are going on in Tommy Lee Jones's personal life, which is, you know, we see that he's estranged from his wife, and, you know, she's putting pressure on him to, you know, support the kid that they have together. You know, he's lost his job, and whilst you obviously sympathise with that state of affairs, these are problems that many people face in their life without launching a paramilitary operation to seize a public landmark.
Yeah, it has been tempting from time to time. If my train's been delayed, there's nothing I want more than to, next time I take my daughters to the playground, I might lock them in and start some sort of war with Sutton Council. But it's difficult because I suppose these films were made on a budget. The director, maybe he'd have loved to have done a Vietnam section or flashback to some of the issues he went through before, but it just seems that is a major issue with the film, and that while it's entertaining, it doesn't necessarily explain his motivations.
And one of the things that's important to sort of note here is that in order to maintain the audience's sympathy for Tommy Lee Jones, a lot of the weapons that he is using as part of this takeover of Central Park are there more for effect. So whilst he does have access to live ammunition, which he does use at various points in the movie, a lot of the time when he is shooting at police officers, actually firing blank ammunition, and some of the explosive charges that he lets off to ward off any attempts by the police to try and infiltrate the park are ones which are sort of more sort of smoke and loud noises rather than ones with actual sort of explosive power. And it felt that rather limited the jeopardy and the stakes of this film, and that combined with the fact that Tommy Lee Jones is occupying the park for 72 hours until Veterans Day, it sort of leaves the film without much sort of jeopardy or stakes, because if Tommy Lee Jones is left to his own devices, this situation will just diffuse itself after 72 hours. There's no need necessarily for the police to do anything.
No, there's only so much he can do. I think Central Park is so large that to control it effectively by one man is impossible. Unfortunately, or fortunately for him, the police and the local authorities seem quite incompetent generally, and do as much to antagonise and cause the issues as he does. I think a lot of what he does is for distraction and effect. It's a dangerous game if you're going to go up against even a seemingly incompetent NYPD. They're going to be armed to the teeth and probably not be governed by any sort of Bill of Rights or anything like that. They seem quite intent on shooting to kill, and it's not the sort of thing that you really want to go into with something that fires blanks and some rather elaborate fireworks. And it's quite obvious from the beginning he had blanks, and it was something they used in Die Hard 2, where it's quite obvious where they would switch from one magazine to another with the coloured tape. But it just seemed like he was putting himself at a huge amount of risk and danger for the sake of this, when, I don't know, maybe it was almost a demonstration of the fact that it was ultimately futile and people still died. It's not like he came away with squatters' rights from the park. He, he was led away after a very impressive explosion, which did nothing except probably cause a few scorch marks on the turf.
Well, you talk about the ending of this film, and it felt to me a little bit like a damp squib, because he stays in the park until the end of the time that he sets for himself. He lets off this huge explosion which doesn't ultimately hurt anyone or destroy anything. And, it's not clear that the world has changed. It's not clear that New Yorkers will be doing anything differently, that they'll be treating their neighbours more kindly, which seems to be largely what sort of Tommy Lee Jones's protest is about. And you kind of think, what's the future here for Tommy Lee Jones? Because whilst he's been using blank ammunition and has been striving not to hurt anyone, you can't think that he is going to get anything other than a very, very stiff custodial sentence.
Yes, because even the deaths that I won't say commits, but the deaths that he causes, which he could argue were in self-defense, because I can't imagine on which planet that an elected official would decide to send in mercenaries. And I think that anything he's done, and I don't blame him for getting a bit antsy. If you're struggling with this, and the New York or the city of New York decide to hire some people who look like they were in a photograph committing war crimes, and sending them in to basically rustle out a squatter, it's an emboldened move, and I guess from the beginning, Yaphet Kotto is. And I've seen him in so many films, and in one of my favourite TV shows, he played the police captain in Homicide: Life on the Street, and he was so good in that, and in being this sort of commanding but compassionate person. And you could tell from the beginning this film was clearly painting him as the person with sense, and that was trying to argue for some sort of decency. But it's the equivalent of sending in the A-team to get him out. And I just found it absolutely bonkers that they'd do it. They'd send in guys with rocket launchers and live claymores who look like extras from the Wild Geese. I think it's just any sense after that. And I think Tommy Lee Jones is walking out with probably a suspended sentence purely on the grounds that they antagonised him so much. They've lost any chance of getting him on a fair trial.
Well, I think we should explore that aspect a little bit more, because in contrast to the honourable protests of Tommy Lee Jones, we have, I guess, the villain of this film, who is the deputy mayor, and he's shown to be more interested in how this event is reflecting on his reputation than he is in preserving the public's safety. And I guess this character is meant to be the manifestation of what Tommy Lee Jones is protesting against, but I didn't really understand his character, and it felt like the film was a bit desperate for a villain, so they made him into one, whether that made a lot of sense or not.
He seemed almost like if in the mayor from the Ghostbusters had been of a slightly different persuasion. He, the mayor in Ghostbusters, while he did inevitably listen to the prospect of registered voters, this guy seemed to be running partly off his own agenda, and the image of New York, which in the 80s was fairly poor. He reminded me of the fact that perhaps the makers of this film would have loved to have Christopher Walken play that role, but he wasn't available.
That would have been good.
Oh, I know. And this was around the time of, I guess, 85, so A View to a Kill. And I know this guy was actually in the Dead Zone with Christopher Walken, and maybe he picked up some tips and thought, you know what, this needs to go up to 11.
Yeah.
But he just seems so both incompetent and, I wouldn't say evil. Evil would be almost giving him too much credit, but he just seems a complete lack of humanity. Which in an elected official or anything like that, you just think, come on.
Well, he's more of a dangerous character than Tommy Lee Jones is. And this deputy mayor, he is the man who, off his own back, decides to hire a couple of Vietnam mercenaries, including one who is actually a member of the Viet Cong, which is an interesting aspect given Tommy Lee Jones's backstory, to basically secretly infiltrate the park and assassinate Tommy Lee Jones's character. And it did seem completely ludicrous that, as mentioned, that an elected official would decide to, off their own back, hire some mercenaries to carry out an assassination.
And that's what it is. It would be an assassination on, down to political motives. And the fact that, this guy is, he's there. And one of the funniest parts of the film, which probably were only slightly intentional, was where the members of various armed forces, security forces, the police got together to discuss what they were going to do. And it all came down to either costs or the slightly deranged egos of old men going, right, what can we do? How do we get rid of this? And all the while, Tommy Lee Jones is obviously oblivious to this, but their attempts at negotiating were fairly short-lived. Their attempts at trying to take the park by force themselves, were difficult. I mean, it's a public park. It's not like a jungle.
Now, this film is clearly very much inspired by First Blood and the success of the Rambo character. In terms of, depictions of the troubles of Vietnam veterans, how do you think, this compares to that film?
First Blood, which came out before this, was so much more into the mindset of the person and the suffering that he received. This was, a guy who, so in John Rambo's case, had come back from Vietnam, and he had some issues, but he was maltreated to the point of torture, really, and the fact that the local police chief was hunting him down. This Tommy Lee Jones just seemed, if they hadn't mentioned that he'd been in Vietnam, you just think he was a guy who had a bad run of luck. He'd, lost a job or was particularly sensitive to being called certain things, which, it's not nice, and you wouldn't want that if you do have a job. But that push that Rambo was this elite killer who, in the case of First Blood, he didn't really do much other than sort of survive because he felt that he was under siege. But Tommy Lee Jones was trying to take this park as a political statement on behalf of someone else. I mean, to be honest, the guy's dead. He could have just said he did it and carried on. He would never have known. But I just don't think that the film didn't give him any sort of motivation in the way that Rambo had. And I think that it suffered massively. And this is where, the scene in First Blood, even in the shower, that part, things like that where you're dehumanizing someone who already feels like they're less because of what they've gone through. And in this case, it's Tommy Lee Jones is struggling to raise money for his kid. Well, that's a horrible place to be. And you do feel sorry for him. But, I suppose in 2018, he'd probably get a Batman suit and climb up Big Ben. But it's it's difficult to sympathize any more than that.
Okay, I think it's time to get to the main purpose of this podcast and discuss the exploding helicopter action. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, Rich and I are going to give our thoughts on the chopper fireball action.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the Cinema Recall Podcast here at ThatMomentIn.com. I am your host, The Vern, and on each episode, myself, along with a guest, will be talking about an iconic scene from a classic movie. Which films will we be discussing? Well, that's all up to you, because before each episode airs, we're going to be giving you a poll of great flicks to choose from. Whichever one gets the most votes, that's the one we'll be talking about. So, listen to the Cinema Recall Podcast on the site ThatMomentin.com, or on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, or Podomatic, or SoundCloud. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy it.
We're back, and now we're looking at the exploding helicopter action in The Park Is Mine. This happens about halfway through the film when police snipers in a helicopter are ordered to fly over the park and take out Tommy Lee Jones. Our Rambo impersonating hero fires at the chopper, but very pointedly at the tail rotor, damaging the whirlybird. Trailing smoke, the damaged helo spins around in the air before making an emergency landing. The crew on board jump out to safety before the aircraft spectacularly combusts. Rich, what did you make of the exploding helicopter action?
I think the first part of the assault on the helicopter was actually quite realistic. I think if you're on the ground with a firearm trying to disable a helicopter, then yeah, that's what you do. You go for the tail rotor and bring it down. I think it was once that the helicopter landed and the crew escaped, that was when it became a cliche from The Simpsons. And I don't see where that explosion came from. I think it's one where clearly there's a defective part and it's landed, and I couldn't see the explosion coming. And obviously, of course, because I'm going to be on this podcast talking about this film, and you see a helicopter, you think, right, here we go. But yeah, it just seemed like the explosion came from nowhere. I found it very surprising, to be honest.
Yeah, it was very odd because, as you say, the helicopter has landed. It's, trailing a bit of smoke, so you think it would just sort of sit there and smoke away relatively peacefully. But as you say, it then suddenly explodes, and it really does explode. It's a very impressive bit of pyrotechnics that they get lined up there, and it's not clear exactly why. I don't know why they didn't have sort of perhaps Tommy Lee Jones give it another spray with his machine gun, and that could have justified why it then blew up and would have remained true to his sort of principles of not harming anyone, because obviously the crew were no longer on board at that particular point. So that might have just helped the believability or the plausibility of that particular moment.
Yeah, because if you're making a statement of intent if you open fire on a helicopter, there's not much you can do to disable a helicopter without running the severe risk of hurting or killing the people on board. And I think it worked out a bit too nicely for his sort of character development. The fact that he brought the helicopter down, it gave the crew just enough chance to escape and then blow up. And I think it would have showed him as a more sympathetic character, and this is where he could have sort of shouted down the radio at the police going, "Oh, look at your helicopter now," and then blow it up, chuck a grenade in at the last second. But I think he set his stall out by shooting at it. So the lives that were saved were not, I wouldn't give him the credit for that. And I just don't see why it didn't explode either earlier or not at all. But to explode when it did after a fairly safe landing, poor form.
Right, I think it's time to wrap things up. Rich, thank you so much for joining me today. Would you like to take a moment to tell people where they can find the Betamax Video Club and how to get in contact with you online?
Well, the Betamax Video Club, it's my podcast. It comes out normally every fortnight, but when I have time, I'll do an extra week. It's available on all good and most bad podcast catchers, iTunes, hosted on Podbean. I'm also on Twitter and Facebook at Betamax Pod. I'll be honest, I'm not very good with Facebook because it normally gets in the way of pictures of my dog. But if you follow the Twitter account, there's plenty on there. It's more of an 80s theme Twitter account than anything else. But it's good fun. There's lots of the usual tropes, and I try and resurrect some of the more forgotten 80s films. I seem to be in a particular phase at the moment of championing the cause of Weekend at Bernie's and Police Academy 6. But lots more podcasts to come, including a particular one that we've touched upon a few times on this one. So come back soon for First Blood.
Yep, and what Rich is hinting at there is I will be the guest on that particular show reviewing First Blood, so I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into that movie. But don't wait for my appearance. Go and check out Rich's podcast now. Do yourself that favour. As always, don't forget to check out the Exploding Helicopter website, where we've got reviews and painstakingly compiled information about films where helicopters explode. If you like the show, spread the word about what we do. We'll be back soon, but until then, keep watching the skies for those exploding helicopters.
This podcast is a proud member of the Lamb Podcasting Network. Find the network at largeassmovieblogs.com.